Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're joining us today to participate in the library's virtual programming. Our topic today covers domestic violence and the effect of COVID-19. And our guest today is Mary Foley, Executive Director of the Merryman House Domestic Crisis Center. We're so glad to have Mary here with us today. Mary, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Bobby. I want to welcome everybody to the virtual session today. It's sort of becoming our new world, if you would. Doing things virtually is becoming a little bit more normal than it was at the beginning. I am not able, Bobby, it says to share the screen, but as soon as you give me that opportunity, I'll pop on to the PowerPoint for today's presentation. There we go. So thank you again so much. There is a place for all of us in this conversation, and certainly in the issue of domestic violence. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and thank you, Bobby, for the introduction. I've been with Merryman House Domestic Crisis Center since 2012, so it is certainly an organization that I love, and I've spent my career since becoming licensed in 2006 as a therapist with child sexual abuse, sexual assault, and now domestic violence. And so the issue of interpersonal trauma and domestic violence is something that has just become part of who I am, and I'm an advocate at heart. So I hope today to give you an opportunity to be able to define domestic violence, maybe technically, but to also be able to spot and understand domestic violence, maybe even outside of the context of a formal definition, because sometimes it looks a little different to us. So I hope that you'll be able to understand what domestic violence is today, that you'll walk away with some concrete ways to identify it or to help those who might be needing your help, and also just some practical ways that you or your family or your group can connect to the Merryman House to get connected, to give help, to give back, whatever it might be the most helpful for you. I do want to talk to you just a minute, though. I play a video, and I know some of you might have seen it, and so that's going to start out our presentation today. And this video does have a trigger warning to it, so sometimes we can be triggered and we don't even know that we are or that we could be. And so I just want to say, if you are sensitive to the issue of domestic violence or child abuse, if you are a survivor watching today, or if you've recently come through an incident of trauma, this video may be very difficult for you to hear. So what I'm going to invite you to do is to either mute the video if it becomes upsetting to you. It's about 2.5 minutes. And so if you need to step away and come back, you're welcome to do that. And if you have littles in your space today, please be mindful that this video might be difficult for them as well. So I'm going to start with this.
On the 21st, 1991, time 22:13 hours. This will be a 911 call, position CT07.
Standing emergency. Standing emergency.
My mom and Daddy are having a fight.
Is he hitting her?
Stop it! Send the police, please.
Okay, we're going to be there. We're taking it.
No.
Let me talk to you. Where's your mom?
What?
What's going on?
They're having a fight because this is bingo forever and ever. They always have this because he has a cousin. He's always drinking beer and getting drunk. And Mom.
What's his name? What is his name? Your father's name?
He's my stepfather.
Okay, how old is he?
No.
What's going on? Lisa? Fighting again. What's going on?
Hurry, Mommy.
How's he hurting her?
He made his mommy.
Okay, don't cry. We're going to send the police.
Okay.
Okay, now where's your mother at right now?
She's in the room fighting with them. Okay, could you just send the police?
Yeah, they're on their way, but I'm going to keep you on the line until they get there, okay? Is your front door open?
Oh, no.
Okay, you go and lock it and come back to the phone so the officers can get in?
This way.
Okay.
He just knocked my sister out.
What sister that he knocked out?
My little sister.
You're
Oh my God!
What's the matter?
Something happened! Just listen to me! Wait, I want to go see what happened, please!
Okay, the police are on their way, okay? Hello? Lisa? The police are on their way, okay?
Mama, the police are coming! My stepdaddy's got the baby now!
Yeah, Lisa, where is he at now?
What?
Lisa, where? Hello?
So I'm going to go ahead and kind of pop out of that. You heard enough there to at least be able to understand the concept here of what's going on in that situation, the crying and the screaming and the chaos. And if you've not seen this video in the past, I can go ahead and tell you that the police are on their way. And as the audio unfolds with that 911 call, what happens in that call is that the abuser in that situation first takes the little sister and the child is afraid for her, and then you hear the child notify the 911 operator that the abuser has the baby, the infant, and you can hear the panic. And then the call ends with the young child yelling for her mom, but you don't hear any response, and the call goes dead. And we're sort of left with this idea of what has happened here and what could be going on. But just if you were able to hear any of what was going on, I'm curious what physical reaction, if any, might you have felt in that moment. And you can type that in your chat box if you can. You don't have to. You just want you to check in and ask yourself when you hear that child cry, or that something, even the narrative on the screen, how does that make you feel physically? And by physically, I'm meaning your heart rate, your breathing, if you're starting to sweat or feel like you need to get up and move. That's what I mean. So I want you to kind of give some attention to that. And then if you could take just a minute to think about how to name the emotions that come out of either how I described the audio or what you read on the screen, what emotions come up. If you could kind of give those a name, because I think that will be important for our conversation later as well. And then if you could think back, but there are different cues that the young girl gives throughout the call that let us know that this may not be the first time that this has happened, that this individual has called before, or that the father in this situation has been abusive. And so she kind of gives us those cues. And so what I do want to talk with you about is how would we practically apply something like this? And one of the reasons why I play this audio or this video, depending on what you're able to see, when I do trainings, is I think sometimes we can get really removed with fancy buzzwords like social justice and this cause that we're about, even tossing around things like domestic violence or intimate partner violence. We become very removed from what it actually means behind closed doors of the homes of the people that we sit in a pew with on Sundays, with the kids that we see in our school systems, perhaps our coworkers and colleagues. We become disconnected from their reality. And so this video is an opportunity for us to really connect with, really what does happen when we have folks in domestic violence situations. So domestic violence has a very specific definition, but before we get to that, what I want you to know about domestic violence is that it is characterized by two main components. So what underpins domestic violence and sets it apart from this idea of an unhealthy relationship or just behaviors within a relationship that maybe aren't as healthy as they should be is the idea of power and control. Power and control are the two core issues found in domestic violence. And then through a whole host of things that we'll go over together, that's how people take power and control from the individual that is the victim. Throughout the conversation today, or our talk today, I will reference he when I talk about the abuser, and I will reference she when I talk about the victim. That is in no way to say that men are not victims. We know that about 1 in 9, at least in the state of Kentucky, are victims. Merryman House serves male victims. So certainly men are victims of not only domestic violence, but we know certainly exposed to domestic violence as children. So that's not to minimize that in any way. But for ease of conversation, he will be what I use when I refer to the abuser, she as the victim. Because what we do know that the literature is very clear is that this crime is disproportionate to women at about 87%. So that's how we'll language around it today. So when we talk about domestic violence and what perpetuates it, and how it is learned, and it is learned, is through observation, experience, and reinforcement. So in this case here with this young caller, she is observing something happening behind the scenes. She is hearing, she is seeing, she is experiencing dad and mom in an argument, and she is very much entrenched in this pattern. And she is not only watching that, but she's experiencing it herself. And then she is not only having it continually reinforced, but so is the abuser in this situation and in most situations. So as the violence goes up, or as the intimidation goes up, or as the control factors come into play, that abuser is getting what he wants, and then it is reinforced and the cycle continues. So it's important to know, if you know anything at all about learning theory, that truly this is a learned pattern of behavior, and it is sometimes generational and entrenched and difficult to break, not impossible, but difficult. But for the purpose of our talk, I really want to spend some time on this idea of power and control, because I think when we understand what underpins domestic violence, we better understand how to respond to it, or how to empathize with it, or how to make a difference in this fight that we are in. In terms of how it is defined in statute, I do think it's important to always note that domestic violence is obviously against the law. Kentucky statute, you can see the reference number right here, does give it a very specific definition. It is physical injury, serious physical injury, sexual assault, or infliction of fear of intimate physical injury, serious physical injury, sexual abuse, or assault. Now, I have bolded the terms fear of imminent, because many times sitting across from survivors, they are really sure that they're going to convince me that their specific incident is not domestic violence because maybe there wasn't a physical injury. Or maybe their circle of friends or their circle of support, as kind as they are and as empathetic as they are, aren't able to help that survivor come to terms with what's happening because there's not a black eye or a broken arm or some sort of physical sign that something has happened. But I think this idea of fear of imminent physical injury or serious physical injury or sexual abuse or assault is much more difficult to define, not only for the survivor, but oftentimes for the law enforcement that are responding, for the ER physician that's on call that night, for the pastor that's sitting across from that individual, or even from the family member and friends. So what I want to say today is domestic violence does have a very specific definition, but it is also in some ways much more broad than we sometimes allow it to be. And so where that fear comes in, where that fear of that threat comes in, that's really where we see that power and control element take root, and where we have to parse it out a little bit more. Now, there is a tool that we use, and if you've been in the field at all or connected to the field at all, you've probably seen it. We reference it often as the power and control wheel. And I find it to be a very interesting tool, because what it does is it does highlight this power and control aspect. And then there are these different spokes that go out from this wheel. And so I want you to just, from where you are in your computer screen, just to take a look at the different spokes on this wheel. And if it's difficult for you to see, it's using coercion and threats, the use of intimidation, using emotional abuse or isolation, denying, blaming, minimizing that other person's experience, using children as a weapon or an element to remove power and control. Male privilege is on here. Economic abuse, that's a big one. I can tell you the number one reason that survivors across the country tell us is their reason for remaining in an abusive relationship is because of financial reasons and concerns. So that's a big part of how power and control is used in the relationship. So when you think about domestic violence following this presentation, I want you to know that it's about power and control. And then there are all these ways that that power and control is asserted or taken from another through these ways. So I might hit you to take power or control. I might threaten to tell something that you don't want told, or threaten to hit you, but never actually do it. I might intimidate you in ways that maybe others don't see. Something that's very common when I sit across from survivors is they'll tell me, well, he put a hole in the wall above my head, but he didn't hit me. Or he kicked the animal or hurt the animal, but he didn't hurt me. Or he said he was going to hurt the animal, but he didn't hurt me. He threw a concrete block through the glass window of the car, but I wasn't in the car. I'm not really sure why he did that. And so what we're hearing when those kinds of things come up is using intimidation or using this fear or this possibility of threat to garner that power and that control. It's often common for survivors to lose contact over time with key family members or friends. More and more and more, the only person sitting in that circle of that victim is the abuser themselves, and no outside input. So those are some examples of how power and control shows up in the relationship, and how we have to be able to kind of listen for those actual physical injuries versus the fear of those things. And both will qualify as domestic violence. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to put those in the chat box. I'm not able to see the chat box, so if I need to pause and answer some questions, I'm happy to do that. Now, it's really important also, I think, when we're having a short but hopefully useful or broad conversation about domestic violence, that we understand that domestic violence, there is a cycle, and that cycle is real. It's been well researched. It's certainly being taught for individuals going into this field. And so I think a lot of times people in the general community or in public and family circles and units maybe see this cycle, but they don't understand it. And they don't understand that it really is a cycle. And certainly survivors that we work with at Merryman House, one of the most powerful educational tools we put in their hands is that this thing called domestic violence is real. Sometimes it's seen, sometimes it's not seen. There's a whole host of ways that it can show up, but it is cyclical. It does have a pattern to it. And so that pattern, that cycle of violence, while the cycle itself has the core pieces of tension, of violence itself, of the honeymoon stage, that cycle can be followed within 24 hours. That cycle might last a week. You might go through that cycle in a month's time and not go back into the cycle for another 9 months. So the length of time may vary, but the hallmark of that cycle is certainly going to be there. And so if we were to play this out, perhaps we have a couple and there's been this idea of fear and there's been these intimidations, and maybe you're looking from the outside in and it just looks unhealthy to you. And then as you learn more, you hear things like, well, I walk on eggshells. I'm afraid to set him off. He said if I, didn't come home right at 5 o'clock, that he would accuse me of having an affair, or I'm going to be in some sort of trouble, or there's going to be this consequence that I pay. And so there's this period of time where the tension is building. And that is where a lot of times survivors fall into this place of believing that if I had just cleaned the house better, or if we had just had more intimacy, or if I had just kept the kids more quiet, or if I had just fill in the blank, then he would not have, or she, if it's a female abuser, would not have gotten so angry. And really what they're describing is that phase of the tension, and it's building and it's building and it's building. And then there comes this moment where the fear of the actual domestic violence, or even the hit, or the sexual coercion, or the name calling, or the emotional psychological berating, where that actually occurs. And once that explosion happens, whether that is an act of violence, or whether that is something psychological, which we know many times can be more damaging, once that occurs, then we see this honeymoon, this recovery phase of, I'm so sorry, if only you wouldn't have done this or that. Maybe there's flowers sent, maybe there's a date night, maybe there's a gift bought that maybe had been promised before. Maybe there's, this attempt to make up. But in that attempt, the abuse is sustained by this fostering of this belief that it is somehow the victim's fault, that the victim led me to this place of having to get this angry, of having to respond in this way. Or maybe there's just a total denial of the abuse altogether. I didn't do that. I didn't do that. You're so dramatic. You're making this up. And so that's part of that honeymoon phase. And so then we stay in the relationship, and then here comes the tension, and then the violence, and then this is where this cycle becomes ingrained and becomes strong. And so I want to put some stats in front of you today about this cycle and how powerful that it is. And I'm not going to read all of them verbatim. You can see them here. I do think that top one is pretty striking. The domestic violence kills or incapacitates more women ages 15 to 49 than traffic accidents and malaria combined. Pretty significant. What we do also know is that interpersonal trauma is likely to lead to those symptoms that we associate with post-traumatic stress disorder, and this idea of a betrayal trauma. And so betrayal trauma is something that we see in the research literature, and it really is just defining that the harm is coming from somebody that you're supposed to be able to trust, that the harm is coming within the context of a relationship that's supposed to be safe, that's supposed to be something that you're valued within. And so when the abuse or the harm comes at the hands of somebody that you trust and that you hold in high regard, that is a betrayal trauma. And what we know is that it most often happens that way in an intimate relationship. And so it's also the most damaging type of abuse. And so then the results of that are significant to the survivor. So those of you that might be listening, that maybe you're a teacher or you work in the healthcare system, maybe you are work in your church or in a community group, and you think, what is the real cost here? Well, there's a lot of information on the occupational cost, absenteeism, job performance, loss of wages. But just in terms of the mental health and the health perspective, we know that trauma and domestic violence, we often see individuals with increased sadness, depression, loneliness. Victims often bear the shame of what's going on, and because of that shame, they remain silent. They've been taught, remember, in this honeymoon stage, that they're making it up, it's not really happening. And so there's this silence, confusion, because they know what they have been through, and yet it's being labeled something else. So we certainly do see a high intersection with that and substance abuse. We know that physical symptoms can be pretty significant as well, so headaches and stomach issues and blood pressure issues. And we also know that many of our survivors have this push-pull. They are afraid to leave the relationship or to escape the relationship because maybe there will be a single parent. They don't feel like they can take care of their kids. Maybe they grew up came from a divorced home and they don't want that for their kids. Maybe they're worried about special needs that the child has and they can't sustain outside of the relationship. And so sometimes all of those things come together that the effects on the actual mental and emotional health really get minimized. So when we think about the effects of domestic violence, behind closed doors, in isolation, this idea of confusion, of mental health struggle, and then we think from that place, right, of all of this turmoil, that our survivors are equipped to know maybe how best to escape that situation. And I think it's really important for you listening. Maybe you've had the thought, we'll talk a little bit about it. Why doesn't this individual get out of this relationship. I think it's important to know that leaving a violent partner is the most dangerous time in the relationship. And so sometimes I think we think, oh, they're finally out of the relationship, it's all going to be okay. And actually that's the most dangerous time. And we know that the rate of attacks on women that are separated are 3 times higher than that of those that are actually gone through the divorce process. And they're 25 times higher than that of married women. So that time of separation is very dangerous. 75% of spouse-on-spouse assault occur at that point of separation. And what we've seen certainly here in our community and across the state of Kentucky, the majority of homicides, suicides occur at that time of separation. So wherever you are joining this, I want you to say to yourself or to really zone in on this last statement, that it is not as simple as leaving. It is not as simple as leaving. It really is about escaping, and that really does shape the conversation much differently. So when we think about common questions versus helpful questions, one that we hear often, why does she stay? Why does she stay? Why doesn't she do this or do that? And I would consider that a common question, but not a helpful question. This one, why doesn't she leave? Same question asked a different way. And in that scenario, who are we putting the responsibility on? And at that point, with everything that we've gone over together, we're still putting it on the survivor. So it's a common question, but it's not helpful. What I would encourage you to do as sort of your first tool in your tool belt today, besides the knowledge that at least you've had an opportunity to hear, is learning to talk about it differently. What is in the way of escape? And that changes, the dynamic between why does she stay, why doesn't she leave, to what is in the way of the escape. Number one, escaping gives elevation to the fact that this is dangerous and it's deadly and it is a prison of sorts for the survivor that's in that environment. So what is in the way of escape? And so what I would say to you is that's when you're going to lean in and when you're going to listen. And you're going to be listening for things like, what are the barriers? Are the barriers transportation? Is it financial? Is it lack of resources? Is it loss of family? Those kinds of things need to begin to shape what we're talking about. So in light of the pandemic that we're in, we have this idea of this silent, invisible issue of domestic violence, social justice issue that is in many homes across the Commonwealth. But now we have this idea of COVID that we also can't see and we're trying to make sense of, and that the actual recommendation is that we stay home, that we don't leave, that we don't escape, that we stay home. And so how do we manage those two things as community members, as individuals, as friends, as family members? And so I think that what I want you to really take home today is this idea that I need to be asking what's in the way of escape and listening for those barriers and listening to those barriers with new ears. So is the violence escalating? And if it is, we know that we're getting into an urgent situation. But if the couple is separated and it's been just really fresh, we know that they're in a higher risk category. So the types of things that we're going to come alongside and do may change. It's important to help survivors plan their response. So even being that friend that is validating that survivor, but also saying, what would you do if? What have you done in the past when? What do you think about this? It's helping that survivor build those neural pathways to plan for when that crisis comes. And in light of COVID and in light of isolation and disconnection, sometimes the most powerful connection we can make is that one to help them plan the what if, so that they're not isolated, at least mentally, they're beginning to prepare for that escape. When you think about safety planning with someone in this situation, I want you to think about harm reduction. And I want you to think about the fact that it's not a prescribed, checklist that we give to somebody. Now we've safety planned. No, it's really collaborative. So if you're in HR, for example, and you've got an employee that's coming to you, or if you are that listening ear, perhaps you're worried about a child that you have that's in what you think now is a domestic violence relationship. Again, you're going to lean in, listen for that barrier, and develop that collaborative response. And what we have to remember is nobody knows the situation more intimately than the survivor. So what has worked before? So before, when they started drinking and getting agitated. What worked? What worked before when you were pinned against the wall? What worked before when you felt confined to the room? What worked before when you couldn't access your car keys? What worked before when your cell phone passwords or your cell phone was locked and you couldn't call? What worked? And then work them back. What worked just before that and just before that, and try to get them as much distance between the crisis that occurred and paying attention to what they could do sooner to keep themselves safe. So we got to think about safety planning as risk reduction, harm reduction. Emergency protective orders, domestic violence orders, interpersonal protective orders, those are all things that are so important. Survivors in Kentucky are guaranteed by statute 24-hour access to a protective order. So by calling the police, by going to the the courthouse when they're open, by calling somebody like Merryman House, your folks can get access, my folks can get access to protective orders. So bringing in other professional supports is really important when we're dealing with domestic violence. Part of what I was asked to talk about is not only domestic violence as it relates to COVID and that pandemic for the survivor, but how it's affected the organization. I do think for those of you that are interested in this topic, it's really important that we acknowledge we are in uncharted territory. But what we do know is isolation can be dangerous, and sometimes home is not a safe place. And so what we've seen for our clients is that their needs did change, and that they have 24-hour needs. They always did, but now it's different. And so one of the things that we noticed is while our crisis calls stabilized and even dropped off a little bit, listening to directors across the state in a conference call that I would join every other week, what we found was our shelter numbers were going up, but also homicides. In the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, I would say in at least 4 or 5 regions across the state, there were at least 1 or 2 murders. And so what is so staggering about that to me is the calls didn't go up, right? Because there's not that opportunity. There wasn't that space to make the call, but yet the lethality went up as well. So in March, this organization moved to a pretty robust pandemic response plan. And what that meant for us was moving folks to place off-site where they could isolate, self-isolate, meant providing those meals in a different way, meant setting up telehealth for our advocates and our therapists. So there was a lot going on behind the scenes. Right now, Merryman House is in phase 3 of that pandemic response. So we do have our campus, our main campus, back open to visitors. Folks still are able to access services via telehealth or in person at reduced capacity. Certainly, all of those checkpoints are in place, social distancing and temperature checks and PPE, all of that stuff is happening. But for you listening in today, what I would want to make sure that you know is if you have a survivor, or if you are a victim and you're in need of services, or you know someone, you know, maybe one of their barriers you're hearing is they don't have a cell phone, or they don't have a way to get in touch with us. They don't have a way to do telehealth. We have grants that will help with that. So please, please, please help them reach out in that way. We saw our messenger use, our Facebook Messenger use go up in terms of people messaging us for help. So those were some of the changes. In terms of things the organization needs to face COVID-19 in a safe and effective way, but also realize that it does create an additional barrier to escape. You know, our food cost, hotel costs, supply costs, those things are all parts that got squeezed a little bit. But like I said, we've worked to develop these partnerships for access to telehealth. We're certainly focused on client protection, but now, right, looking at staff protection in a very different way. So how do we make sure those providing the care are healthy at home and healthy at work and able to be those hands and feet, to be that other voice on the phone or on the text message or on the messenger message that is there to provide help and connection. And so those are additional variables that have come into play during COVID-19, and I expect that they'll be with us for quite some time. So as we get ready to close out today, I just want to remind you of the mission of the Merryman House, which is to save, build, and change lives affected by domestic violence. And I think in that mission statement, what I see is the seriousness and the risk for death that is inherent in domestic violence. It is very serious. And so life-saving services like a 24-hour crisis line, an emergency shelter, protective orders, working with law enforcement, relocating folks in an emergency situation, finding them another state to go to, or a plane ticket or a bus ticket. Life-saving services literally save lives. Life-building services. Domestic violence has catastrophic effects. It hurts people financially, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in some of the most basic ways in terms of threatening housing or causing food insecurity, to more of those long-term effects like those we mentioned, sadness and depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. So life-building services include on-site mental health professionals, housing and advocacy teams, youth teams, folks to do case management and run groups, to provide food and to provide that stability and that connection out of that isolation, legal services. And then there's this idea of life-changing services. Well, folks sometimes are having to start over. And so life-changing services for the Merryman House means we're going to help them repair their credit, or help them get that immigration documentation that they need, or bridge the language barrier gap they may have, help them find that affordable place to live. So life-saving, life-building, and life-changing services are certainly in line with our mission. And if you need more information on our mission, I would invite you to look at merrymanhouse.org. We did move to a new campus, so I just wanted to showcase it just a little bit. You can see our dining hall. We serve about 1,500 meals out of that dining hall for our outreach clients as well as shelter clients, and we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And also just wanted to show you, this is just a glimpse into some of the accommodations. So our shelter is 36 beds. It does have a warming kitchen in it, nursing mom's room, common areas, and suites that have their own bathroom. So it is a communal living environment, but every suite has its own bathroom, which is helpful. And we do offer services, I think, in very comfortable surroundings and settings. So therapy and play areas are all part of what we do here at Merryman House. And then our Ray and Kay Eckstein Community Outreach Building. So Paducah does have its own office for those not living on campus but still needing our services, and so that they can find those for Paducah here in that building. And if Paducah is not the best place for you, you can find us in Callaway County in the George Weeks Center, Marshall County Public Health Department, or our Resiliency Center on Main Street, Graves County Health Department, and also in Fulton County. So if you don't need emergency shelter, but you're a survivor or you need those resources and that connection, you can certainly find those at those office locations. And in closing today, I wanted to make sure and link you with some great educational information about how to access regional programs like those by the Merryman House, as well as protective order information. You can get those on our coalition website at kcadv.org. And of course, our website as well. So that's all I have for the presentation today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
How many staff are at the Merryman House?
Thank you. So yeah, the staff of Merryman House is right around 50 staff to run our 24-hour shelter and the 8 counties that we cover in our outreach offices. We also provide all the coverage for the court in those 8 counties. So we have about 50 staff that operate Merryman House. Merryman House is a comprehensive advocacy and support center. We never close, so much like a hospital, we never close, open 365 days a year.
Mary, this is a great presentation. It reiterates such a good service that we have in our community. I see a chat. It says, can you talk on tours and opportunities for getting involved?
Yeah, so Merryman House has talk-in tours that you can schedule. Outside of COVID, it was a little bit easier, so we might put you through a little more hoops, but our talk-in tours are at least every month and sometimes twice a month, where you can schedule you and a group of individuals who just need to learn about our agency and what we do. And you can come and we'll give you a presentation, we'll feed you a free lunch, and we'll give you a tour of the campus. The main campus is located on Berger Road in Paducah. It's not private anymore. We feel like we need for folks to find their safety in the fact that the community is behind them and supporting them. We do have security measures, of course, in place. and you are escorted all over the campus. But it's a great opportunity to connect with the organization, to hear about what it does and how you might see yourself in our mission and in our vision. And it also helps us to connect with folks that we can serve and that we can assist and we can refer to. So if you'd like to get connected in that way, you can shoot us a message on the website. You can give us a call at our main number, which is 443-6001. And I did have that on a slide. I don't see it. And that's 443-6001. And Kayla, our community engagement coordinator, would love to assist you in getting on campus to learn more about what we do.
Are there any other questions? I noticed Ann Bidwell is joining us. She is our presenter for the next McLib Live, and it reiterates to me what a giving community this is and what a community we have with so many wonderful resources.
I couldn't type fast enough, but I never miss an opportunity for Mary to speak or to tune into my library. So I'm excited. I hope to see everybody next week.
Thank you, Anne, for that. Somebody asked if, Ms. Adams, if we had an active case and the victim is housed at Merryman House, can we get in touch? Yeah, that's tricky, isn't it? So HIPAA and other federal law requires us to not confirm or deny whether or not we have a client at Merryman House. So if you are a community partner and you are needing to get in touch, the easiest way is to have that client on the front end sign a release of information, and that's the smoothest way. But sometimes that's not possible, or that moment has passed. What you can do is call that main number, that 443-6001, and you can say who you are and that you want to leave a message for that individual. Our staff are not going to confirm or deny whether we have them, but we will put it on the message board. If we are able to get that message to them personally, we will take it and say, hey, so-and-so is trying to get in touch with you. And then they can give you a call, and then we encourage them to get a release that way. So you're not going to get past that gatekeeper at first without a release, but we will take the message and do our very best to get you the information that you need.
If there are not any more questions, Mary, we thank you so much for being our guest today. This presentation was so informative. I hope others will share this message to their friends, to their family, to their neighbors, to the community. There are such good resources available, and I hope people will take advantage of this. Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you for joining us today.